right, well, given everything we have to do today, I'm going to get us started. Welcome, everyone. Again, as you're signing in, my name is Charlene Margot, and I'm the founder and director of the Parent Education Series. This organization was actually founded 15 years ago in the Sequoia Union High School District to address timely issues that impact the health, safety, and well-being of our children and teens. We're proud to say that after 14 years, we've had over 85,000 attendees, and the program continues to grow. We could not be more delighted today to have a conversation with some of the nation's most leading voices. They are authors and experts. They are parents and scientists and developmental psychologists. So again, we're in for a big treat today for a very important and timely conversation about something that is not easy to talk about in America, and that is race and racism. So again, I want to thank our collaborators, the Sequoia Union Healthcare District, the Sequoia Union High School District, the Parent Education Series, and our new nonprofit, the Parent Venture, which will extend the work of the Parent Education Series to more schools and communities across the nation. Again, from the Sequoia Healthcare District, special thanks to Dr. Karen Lee and CEO Pamela Kurtzman for supporting this program. We have a couple of future events I just want to touch on quickly. Next week on Thursday, July 23rd, we are bringing What Now? Exploring the Community College Transfer Program. And on Thursday, July 30th, a wonderful event called Better Digital Parenting, Research-Based Strategies for Unprecedented Times. Again, our presenters today will be leading a timely conversation, and we will be offering questions. These questions have come from parents, they've come from the community, and from the panelists themselves. So for the first portion of our conversation today, I will be asking questions of our panelists, and then at the end, there will be a little Q&A. If any of you are not familiar with Zoom, and again, welcome as everybody is coming in. I'm Charlene Margot, Director of the Parent Education Series. We have a very distinguished panel with us today. We want to get started, but before I tell you about our panelists, I just want to point out a few housekeeping details. If you are not familiar with Zoom, you will see at the bottom various icons. At the end of the program, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A button. You'll see in chat there are links already posted. My partner Bev Hartman is with us today from the Parent Venture. She will be monitoring the chat. Also, if you have things that you want to say during the conversation, please feel free to add them. All right, so we are going to start again with about 50 minutes of conversation with our panelists, responding to questions, and then we'll end with a few questions from the audience. Let's get started. Ladies first. Julie Lythcott-Haims is the former Dean of Freshmen at Stanford University. She is the author of the New York Times bestselling and anti-helicopter parenting manifesto, How to Raise an Adult. The award-winning memoir, Real American, on being Black and biracial in white spaces, and the forthcoming book, Your Turn, How to Be an Adult. Eric Abrams. Born in Berkeley, raised in Oakland and Chicago, Eric Abrams' career in higher education has included roles in undergraduate admission at USC, Stanford, and Pitzer College, as well as admission offices of the Stanford MBA program and Berkeley Law. He currently serves as Chief Inclusion Officer at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. And he believes that diversity is more than how one looks, it is also about how one thinks. Donald, are you here with us? There you are. Hi, Donald. Dr. Donald Grant is Executive Director of the Center for Community and Social Impact at Pacific Oaks College in Pasadena, California. He began his career as a middle school science teacher in Baltimore, Maryland, and he holds a BA in biology and a doctorate in clinical psychology. Donald is an international speaker and workshop facilitator, film and TV consultant, and his latest book, Black Men, Interracial Colonialism and Behavioral Health, A Noose Across Nations, was published in 2019. And lastly, but definitely not least, Kareem Graham. Raised in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, Kareem earned a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Rice University and completed his PhD and postdoctoral training in immunology at Stanford University. He was an assistant professor in the School of Medicine at Emory University and he currently works as a drug discovery scientist in the biotech sector. He lives in Burlingame with his wife and 2 children, ages 9 and 13. I'm sorry we can't all be together, but let's give a big virtual welcome to our distinguished panel today. All right, let's get started. If you would, everyone, give us a brief description about yourself and what brings you to today's conversation. Let's see. Again, not to put pressure on anybody, but Eric, let's get you started.
Thanks, Charlene, and welcome to everyone who's joined us. Again, I'm Eric Abrams, and I think, honestly, my journey to this conversation started in high school. As Charlene said in my intro, I was raised mainly in the Bay Area. Actually went to 4 years of grade school in Menlo Park, middle school in Chicago, but early in high school, my parents split up, and I went from being, you know, one of the few chocolate chips in the cookie at the schools I attended to an all-black, all-male Catholic high school on the south side of Chicago. And I suddenly became aware of all of these differences, and I wanted to fix them. I wanted to solve them. And honestly, my first thoughts on how to solve them were not peaceful. But I realized that I might know some people who have some knives and maybe 1 or 2 person who has a gun, but I don't know anybody who has a tank or a plane. And so if I want the revolution that I want, it's going to have to be a peaceful one, or people like me are going to die.
Okay, Julie, take it away.
Sure thing. Charlene, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here with Eric and Kareem and Donald as well. Charlene, you're such a leader on the peninsula in parent education, and I'm always honored to be asked to be a part of anything you're doing, so thank you. As was said, I'm Black and biracial. I wrote a memoir about what it was like to grow up as that type of person in white spaces. Grew up predominantly in Wisconsin, moved around a lot, but high school and a few elementary school years were in Wisconsin, where I was the only chocolate chip in the cookie. And so my life has been very much lived as the other until I came to Northern California and really found community here. My journey has been from being an innocent child who learned at about age 4 that something was wrong with my amazing daddy. My very dark-skinned, tall father would get really hateful looks from strangers, and I couldn't have called it racism when I was 4, but those looks frightened me and taught me that, you know, daddy was in danger, and I began over time to glean that I was perhaps in danger too, whereas my white mother did not get looks like that. And I think being a biracial kid, I could see clearly how the world treated my Black parent differently from my white parent. Despite being outwardly successful, going to brand name college, brand name law school, having brand name careers, I, at that point, by age 17, was really in a place of self-loathing around my Blackness because the world had taught me to be ashamed of myself. And I carried that with me for decades and didn't really come to do the work of locating a self I could love, is how I put it, until my late 30s, early 40s. So my journey has been from innocence to self-loathing to self-love. And the self-love kind of coincided right with the start of the Black Lives Matter movement, trying to raise a Black son here in Northern California in light of everything that's happening, trying to show up to be the parent my kid needs me to be. So that's a glimpse of who I am and why I care to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Julie. Again, if you have not read her memoir, Real American, we recommend it highly. As she said, Julie takes you through this journey, and it's a really wonderful story. Everyone should read it. Kareem, I'm going to ask you next, and I just want to let people know that we're going to be sending resources to you and links to various articles and websites. I met Kareem through a counselor at Menlo Atherton High School, who's a very dear friend of his. Actually, I believe Kareem introduced her to her future husband. But he wrote an op-ed piece in the San Francisco Chronicle called White Parents Talk to Your Kids About Race. So again, thank you, Kareem, for being here. Why don't you tell us again a little bit more about yourself and how you came to this conversation?
Well, thank you, Charlene, for having me, and it's wonderful to be here with you and all the other panelists, and welcome to everyone. You know, as far as my journey goes, you know, I think I see a lot of similar threads with Julie's journey in terms of you know, growing up and you know, being othered, growing up in predominantly white spaces, but as a child not having the maturity or the vocabulary to really know how to process you know, subtle and overt racism. You know, as I grew up and, you know, within my education, you know, you develop these defense mechanisms, and you learn to, you know, move through spaces so that you can be accepted and feel comfortable and feel safe. And I think, you know, the piece that I wrote really just came from a place of trying to process what's been going on in this country, you know, especially over the last several weeks with, you know, the horrible murders of innocent Black civilians by vigilantes and law enforcement officials alike. For me, it was just part of an effort to, you know, process, you know, what's going on in this country and try to add something to the conversation, try to make some contribution, because I think at the end of the day, we just want to try to make this world a better place, you know, for our kids especially. And so, you know, that's sort of the big picture view of my journey. You know, I'm a father, I'm a husband, you know, but I'm a person that really wants to make this world better for my kids and safer for my kids who are biracial, Black and biracial.
Thank you so much, Kareem. And we will send out to everyone a link to his article, which again, we recommend highly. It is thoughtful. As Kareem said, he's a private person, so it took something to really get that op-ed written and out into the world. So we thank you for being with us today. Donald, let's hear from you. I know we are delighted to have you bring a developmental perspective to the discussion.
Awesome. So grateful to be here. Thank you for having me. Great to hear everybody's story. My story is a little different. I grew up in Buffalo, New York. I grew up in a housing project amongst a lot of Black folk, kind of seeing these systems of oppression play themselves out. And I remember when I was 13, we just moved to a nicer ghetto where people on the street owned their homes, but it was still very under-resourced. But I was bused to a magnet school outside of my community that was very diverse, City Honors High School in Buffalo, New York. And it really provided a foundation where nobody in my neighborhood necessarily knew what a FAFSA was. My parents had attended business school, but never a four-year institution. And I found myself at Hampton University right out of high school, which is the complete opposite, if you will, cadre of Black folk who I had been around growing up. And so for me, early on, I got this dichotomy of Blackness and wanted to know what that was about. Black exceptionalism and the historical context was very important for me. And so my book, over 10 years of research, it took me to really get it down. And it's Black Men, Intergenerational Colonialism and Behavioral Health, A Noose Across Nations, and it's published by Palgrave Macmillan. And actually, they just contacted me to have a free PDF available for social justice readers, so everybody can access the book for free through a PDF. You go to Springer once you Google the site, Google the title, Springer link will get you the book for free. My goal is to help people practice mindfulness and really understand the processes of owning who you are. My next book that I'm working on right now is actually exploring the intergenerational nature of the oppressor role, which is something we don't often talk about. What are the consequences of having 10 generations of people whose identity was predicated upon being an oppressor and a divider, and what does that mean? And so that's a lens that I come from, looking at development across the lifespan. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Donald. That's incredible. Congratulations on having your book be available for free. That is fantastic news. We will have that going out to attendees in the a follow-up email as well. So here's the question that really brought us to this conversation, and the title is really, again, taken from Kareem's article, Talking to Your Kids About Race. All of you are parents. Some of you, like Eric and Julie, you have kids who are a little bit older. I have young adult children. Donald and Kareem, your kids are a little bit younger. Can you comment on when you began talking to your own children about race, and what did you say? Anybody, feel free to start this off.
If you don't mind, I'll start. My wife and I are one of the only monoracial Black families at my son's school. He goes to a really elite small private school here in Los Angeles. And so in kindergarten, when he entered that space, because we knew that he was going to be in a space of danger with a lot of white privilege, a lot of white wealth, and we knew what that meant. We also knew that as he developed across time, he was going to be a big boy. He's 10 years old now. He's going into the 6th grade. And I actually recorded our conversation about race and put it on my IGTV for white families and other families to have a model to be able to do this, because it's not an easy conversation. But for me, and I'm imagining many of the co-panelists here, we don't have the luxury of waiting to talk about it, because what I want to be able to do is in any way I can to prevent maximum injury, right? And so he's going to be injured regardless when he's no longer invited to the pool party because he's a 6 foot tall 8th grader. He's going to be injured, but if I can prepare him for that injury, I can make it non-traumatic. And so I began talking to my son right before kindergarten about race, because research demonstrates that 4th grade children at 4 years old, children begin to behave and treat other kids differently based on race and culture and ethnicity. And so the book that states that is The First Hour of Racism. It's a case study on preschool children and their behaviors based on race and phenotype.
Wow. Kareem, do you want to comment on that? Did you speak to your children that young?
Yeah, I believe that with my kids, we had, my wife and I, very clear conversations with them about skin color from a very early age, and really just framed it in the context of that people have different colored skin, and as people also have different colored eyes and different features, and that makes the world a much more interesting and beautiful place. We want to celebrate difference as something that's very, very powerful and wonderful. I think for my daughter especially, the conversation became a little bit more concrete. When she was 5 years old, she came home from kindergarten, and she asked my wife very directly, am I black or am I white? That was the topic of discussion at school that day. And so after kind of,
that'll force you into the conversation.
Yes. Yeah. Like you said, Donald, we don't often have the luxury of waiting to have these conversations. So, I think at that time we maybe fumbled around a little bit, but we did give my daughter a word, biracial, that became part of her vocabulary. And so I think it's very important to give kids tools and words that can help them explain the world around them. I will say that there's another conversation, though. There's a conversation about race, but a separate conversation is about racism. And that's one that is often thrust upon Black parents. Racism makes it its own schedule. And so I know that for me and a lot of other Black parents, it's often brought about by racist experiences, racist incidents that either I or my kids have experienced, and then trying to, build them up and then, try to explain to them the bigger picture and really tell them that what happened to them was wrong, and provide, some level of comfort and support.
Thank you, Kareem. Julie, you talk about being Black and biracial in your memoir. How does that question, how did that impact the way you talk to your children?
Yeah, sure. So my partner is a white Jewish guy. I've been with him for 32 years, and we have 2 children. They're now 21 and 18. And my son is the 21-year-old, and he presents to the world phenotypically as an African-American male. He's a little bit darker than I am. He's got a big afro. His facial features just say Black. And beautiful. My daughter resembles her father more. She's also beautiful, but really in white spaces passes for white. I think you have to be yourself, probably a multiracial person, to appreciate the features that she's got that make you go, I know you're something. Let's try to figure out what you are. So I've had to really try to raise these 2 quite differently. I want to acknowledge what W.E.B. Du Bois has taught us about double consciousness. Our identity is in part how we see ourselves, but in part how we are seen in the eyes of others. And I'm very conscious of that with both of my kids, as I think any Black parent is. With my son, it's been about how to, equip him with so much self-love that when he encounters stuff out there, he doesn't, begin to worry, is there something wrong with me? I want him infused with the vaccine that I'm constantly giving him booster shots for as he's growing up about, you are worthy of love. You are worthy of dignity. Like, you're an amazing human. And if anybody has anything bad to say about you, that's their problem, not yours. However, sometimes people are violent. Sometimes people are cruel. This is what you need to know in order to be safe out there and come back home to us safely. That's a message he has needed that she has not needed. My daughter, frankly, in some ways has not the greater challenge, but the more, as a parent, it's been a hard challenge around how do you equip a child who can pass for white in white spaces with the self-love that she's going to need. So when she hears the N-word, she feels I can stand up and speak to it, as opposed to being ashamed or afraid or what have you. I'm trying to raise a kid who will be that accomplice, and say, you may not realize it by looking at me, but I am Black. I have Black ancestry, and this is not okay with me. And I watch her as she's just making her way out into the world at the college level, having those experiences. Sometimes she'll share them with me. And she's very clear, Mom, I don't want to claim, I don't want to appropriate an experience I have not had. So how do I narrate to which piece of this can I own, basically, so that I am staying in my lane, but speaking out at the same time. And I think for any kid who is racially ambiguous, that's a nuance.
Thank you, Julie. Really, really amazing story, especially that you are raising both kids slightly differently. I think that's so interesting. Eric, I have young adult kids, and I know you also do. Do you remember when you started talking to your children and what you said?
Yeah, it was it was back in the distant mist. I mean, my sons are 25 and 23 now. But very early, like a couple of the other panelists, my kids are multi-ethnic. My wife is Latina. And before kindergarten, my oldest son asked, Daddy, how come Mommy and Gabe and I are different colors than you? Because they all took after her color-wise. And so we started having conversations at that point. Donald's point about raising a large child was really, really resonated with me. You can't tell through Zoom. I'm 6'5", 270. My kids are both my height or taller. And so we had to negotiate, pretty early, how do you move through this world when people perceive you as a threat, even if you're just a goofy, friendly kid? And so we started having conversations about that, certainly before they were 10.
Wow. One thing we have today is a very tall panel, I'm noticing. All right.
I'm fine.
Yeah, okay. So the next question actually was posed through Kareem's article. So Kareem, I'm going to let you speak to this one. We know that our audience today of attendees is probably of various races, but they may be mostly white. So what is the main message you would like white parents to pass on to their children? What can and should we be doing better?
That's a very complicated question. There's no simple or single answer to it. But I think, what's really important is that everyone should be taking an interest in this fight, that it should not just be left to people of color to fight for justice and equity. You have to understand that everyone's got skin in the game, whether you realize it or not, whether you have Black friends or not, whether you live in a progressive community or not, that this impacts on all of us in very real ways, and that for Black people in particular, there is no respite from the threat that this issue of structural racism poses to our health and safety. I have a son who's also he's 9 years old. He's on the bigger side. He projects to be about 6'4", 6'5", and so I do really fear for him and what the future may hold for him if he doesn't have the right tools to navigate the world. And it's a very unfair burden that no kid should have to be faced with. But that's the reality for for Black parents and people and kids of color. And so I think, what I would hope that white parents would do is just have a little humility in tackling this issue, and be open to feedback, be open to correction, because it is a very tough task. But I know that sometimes it's easier to kind of resign or shrink to the background, because these conversations are so difficult that people are afraid to say the wrong thing. But just like I could say, I'm not gonna exercise because I might pull a muscle. I think you have to be willing to put yourself out there and make mistakes, because that's how we're going to all get better together.
Thank you, Kareem. Anybody else want to add to that? No.
I think that willingness to kind of be uncomfortable in uncomfortable situations and know that, none of us has all the answers. We're all going to make mistakes when it comes to these issues. It's not about being perfect. I do think it's about very much, giving it a shot, and also being willing to apologize and own it when we do make mistakes.
I think it's also about doing the work. I feel like, to Kareem's point, it's hard to talk to your kids about racism if you haven't dealt with your own privilege or your own racism or your own experiences with racism. And I feel like it's just right now we're in a new space in history where white people are being held accountable for what I call street level racism, meaning that no one died. It was still injurious. It's bigger than a microaggression, but less than a lynching. And historically, when we look at Emmett Till and what happened with him, those things have been allowed to go for years and years and years. And I feel like right now we're looking at the weaponization of white women tears in a different way than we have before. And there's a level of accountability. And so as a result, I think that we have 75% of all public school teachers being white women. This is the first time they've been really forced to reconcile how their phenotype, how their existence has been used as a huge oppressive force. And that's a tough pill to swallow, right? It's tough to sit with yourself and say, even though I am not complicit necessarily in this, I recognize that this is happening. And what do I do with that? Until you reconcile that, it's impossible to really have not reconcile it until you approach it. It's hard to have an honest conversation with your children about racism. You can talk about race all day, but to Kareem's point, a discussion about race and a discussion about racism are two very different things.
Just to add that, it's been shocking and a little bit wonderful, but also shocking at how many white friends and colleagues have learned in the last 5 weeks that systemic violent racism is routinely meted out to Black folk. We on this panel have not had the luxury of ignoring that fact. But there's something about the coronavirus and the fact that everyone's watching, is on Zoom, I guess, and looking at social media. George Floyd's murder was seen by a lot of people. And that has led to progress. And it is good that progress is happening. My question, though, for parents of all races who are not Black, did you learn about Tamir Rice? What were you listening to the year Tamir Rice was gunned down? And I raised Tamir Rice's name because he was a child. He was, I think, the youngest child that I'm aware of that we've lost to police violence, age 12, Cleveland, Ohio, playing with a toy gun in a park. Cop shows up, thinks he's a Black man with a gun, shoots him dead, comes to realize he's a child at my feet with a toy and doesn't offer him CPR, okay? Where was your anger? My news feed filled with that. I became enraged and anguished and just, right? But I saw these cat videos and ha, he, this and that. And I thought, what narratives are y'all paying attention to such that you have the luxury, or did you hear the story and just decide not to care? And the work that I've been doing lately is, why do you not care? Why is it that you do not actually see us as human in the way you are? Because if you see us as human, if you feel that our blood is like your blood and our tears are like your tears, and we love our children and are in anguish over harm coming to our children just as you do, you would be enraged about what we experience as a community. And so I realize we all have different theories of change about like, where do we do the work in order to make the change? My theory of change is at the individual level. Folks need to ask themselves, do I see Black people as fully human? And if so, how do I know? How does it show? How do my kids know that I hold that value? How am I showing up in the world to try to make my world kinder and safer for Black people? That's the question that I invite white parents and others who are not Black to sit with, and sit with that. You can't be what you're trying to be for your kids until you reckon with those questions within yourself.
Charlene, may I add to that really quickly? I know we don't have a lot of time, but I think it's such an important point. And it's important to note that the world has been trained to not see Black people as human. When you talk about the whole theory of cognitive dissonance, when a slave owner was beating a enslaved person till their back opened wide up, they had to convince themselves that this individual was not human in order to maintain that behavior. The tension created by cognitive dissonance would not allow them to humanize that person, as they were taking these men from plantation to plantation, forcing them to rape women, to breed enslaved people. It's impossible to live with yourself if you see them as human. And so as a result, chattel slavery, the three-fifths compromise, all those things happen. And right now we're seeing that operationalize itself with this horrible number of Black women and babies dying on the birthing tables. And you can read Harriet Washington's Medical Apartheid that just tells the whole story on how the dissonance associated with our dehumanization still lives today. And so I wanted to add that point to Julie's point to say, it's not, if a white person comes to terms and says, wow, I really just reconciled that I don't see Black people as human, like, own that so you can move beyond it, understanding that the structures of the world has made that so for you, and it's legitimate, and you have to break it.
That's right.
Wow, okay, well said, everyone. These are tough questions, but great answers so far. Some of you have mentioned needing to come to terms with racism in your own self, your own being. Julie, you mentioned that, and also in society. How would you advise children to respond to racism they identify with their peers at school or even within their own families? Anybody? Eric, you look like you want to say something.
Because most of us tend not to want to be directly confrontational, especially in the face of something that's horrifying. But I think that's exactly what we need to figure out how to teach our kids to do. And perhaps it's about being confrontational and, depending on the age of the child, in a non-confrontational way. I think it's okay to say, hey, I don't think that's cool. It doesn't have to be a big flight and blow everything up until it has to be. But to start by saying, hey, that's not, teach your kids to say, hey, that's not cool behavior, or I have friends who are like that and they're not like that, or I have, relatives or family members, or I don't see that in my life. What are you talking about? Just to push back. I think that's one of the first steps we can do, is encourage our kids to push back against the racism and sexism and homophobia and other isms that we see.
Thank you, Eric, good advice. Anybody else? Kareem, Julie?
I'll add that, I rely a lot on Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt's work. She's right up the street here at Stanford. Her book, Biased, and her work more broadly earned her the MacArthur Genius Award. It's that important, and she is our expert, our nation's expert. So get that book, Biased, if you don't have it. It's about the implicit bias that is baked into our brains because we grow up in a society like this. The key message is it's in there, and it's on all of us to slow down our thinking, develop a mindfulness practice. As Dr. Donald Grant had mentioned, I too have worked hard to develop a mindfulness practice to slow my thinking down so I can be in charge of what I'm about to do next and what I'm about to say next, instead of just, saying it or doing it or reacting. And that's been my personal journey around undoing the stereotypes I have in my own head about people I might stereotype for all kinds of reasons. It's, my trick is, when I notice a stereotype coming, because I've developed the practice where I can notice as I'm meeting somebody, I can sort of feel the stereotype coming. I say to myself, oh, gee, you're about to stereotype this person on the basis of their skin color, their apparent religion, their apparent socioeconomic status. There are all kinds of reasons why I might be biased. And I notice it coming, and I say to myself, you're about to stereotype them. How about you treat them like they're your best friend? And then my eyes fill with delight, and I put a smile on my face, and I'm just treating them like a human being, which is what we all want and need and deserve. You're simply trying to interact with this other person in a manner, frankly, that with which you want to be treated. It is do unto others, but it's undo the bias in your brain so that you can do unto others as you want others to do unto you. There is work to be done at the level of our own psyche, and we have the capacity to do it, and we have to teach it to our children.
Julie, that reminds me of something Kareem mentioned in his article, which is that kindness is not enough. Many of us, especially people like me, a white person, I don't see myself as a racist, but boy, have I learned a lot in the last 2 months. That even Jennifer Everhart, Professor Everhart, talks about being on an airplane with her own 5-year-old son, and him saying to her, Mommy, looking at another man on the plane who turned out was African American, a Black man, and her son said to her, Mommy, is that man going to rob us? That even someone raised by a professional person educating all of us about bias, her own son had absorbed it through the culture, right?
We haven't said yet, Jennifer is Black. Her son is Black. So this was a Black child of 2 Black parents seeing one Black man on a plane saying, is he going to rob us, right? He ingested that stereotype, despite all of those protective factors you'd think would mean he wouldn't have.
If you drop a dropper of bleach in a fish bowl, it's going to evenly distribute itself out and reach and toxify everything. We have women who say, I would never have a female doctor. We have Latinx people who say, I would never have a Mexican lawyer. Internalized oppression is real, and it's a structure of white oppression. It literally is a structure of white oppression where individuals who are of color experience that. And Charlene, you made such a good point earlier. Individuals who are not actively anti-racist are in fact supporting racist ideologies and philosophies. And so a lot of people don't understand the difference between a bystander, an ally, an accomplice, and a co-conspirator. And just very briefly, we know what a bystander is. An ally is somebody who's going to go to the march and they're going to make a beautiful sign and they're going to walk and they're going to scream and they're going to yell. The accomplice is the guy who goes into his boss's office and says, I know that Charlene is making 30% less than me. I'm willing to take a salary decrease in order to increase pay equality. An accomplice and a co-conspirator has skin in the game, and that's what we need people to understand. If you don't have skin in the game, you are silently endorsing systems of oppression, whether it's transphobia, homophobia, racism, sexism, whatever it is. If you're not actively fighting to dismantle it, you are supporting it.
I'm going to give you a minute here, Kareem, because you touch on this in the article, but here's a question, for example, that perfectly explicates this point. A parent writes that she has a young child who's going to a laboratory preschool. He's bilingual. We're from Russia. He sees lots of kids of various races in his classroom, but so far he hasn't brought up the question about different skin colors. And she says, I keep waiting for him to ask me about it, but maybe he won't. How do I start? So again, waiting for the child to bring up the discussion rather than helping the child see that kids and people come in all different colors. Kareem, how do you respond to that?
Well, I'll first acknowledge that I'm not an expert in, child development or child psychology, but I think it's important not to make any assumptions about what your kids know or what you think they know. I think you have to just ask questions and try to understand what's in their mind, what are they thinking about, and making sure that your values are coming through. I think you have to be direct and very explicit about when it comes to these issues, and because I think that it's too easy to fall into a pattern of complacency and just assume that, well, because maybe we live in a diverse community and everybody gets along, that we don't have a problem here. I just to make one other quick point, I think I view this as all of us being on a cruise ship. I know no one's taking cruises right now, but if you could just indulge me for a little bit. And the cruise has lots of opportunities for entertainment. There's shows, there's a beautiful buffet, there's all kinds of activities. And we can all treat each other nicely, and we can all have a great time and get along great. But there's a hole in the boat. This hole is structural racism. If we don't get to work on actively fixing that hole in the boat, it doesn't matter how kind we are, we're all going to sink. And I think that's the kind of urgency that a lot of Black parents, the panelists here today, feel is that this is urgent work that needs to be done. We need to address it, and we can't sweep it under the rug any longer.
Thank you. So Donald, you mentioned there's different ways that people can respond to what they see. Micro and macroaggressions, racism, all of the kind of behavior that we witness every day in person and on Nextdoor and everywhere we look. So how would you define allyship at different ages? Can you teach a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old different ways to be allies, to support societal change and breaking down some of the systemic walls of racism?
That's a great question. And so many people have a difficult time identifying what to do when at different chronological stages of development. And so one of the first things to do, in my opinion, is to help kids understand that unfairness hurts. And every kid can identify when they've experienced pain or some sort of injustice. And so creating a foundation to understand that hurts is really important. And then you give people an opportunity to understand what it feels like to not be heard. You have small children who are asking for things all the time. And at some point they start yelling and they say, I'm asking for Nutella and I can't get Nutella. And they're yelling, they're 3. And you help that kid understand that, for instance, when you're talking about riots and uprisings, that, this group of people have been asking for certain things for generations and they've never gotten it. This is why it looks like this. And so I think one of the first allyship lessons that we first started to see in school was when we started to discourage boys from saying that's gay in the locker room, right? You teach a boy to say that and really say to his friends, give him the armor to do that. We have to give kids language. And so the first thing really foundationally is to help a 4-year-old say, when you see somebody treating somebody else unfairly or differently, understand that hurts. What do you want to happen when you're hurt? And that gives them the underlying capability to step in and say, you're hurting them at the very least. At the very least, you're hurting them. And then you build tools as they get older and older to really develop language to say, now you're being racist or you're being homophobic or you don't get to say the N-word. Why not? Because you don't. And I know you've been told throughout your life that you get to do everything you want to do, but this time you don't. There are certain things you can't do. And so there's levels to it. But the foundational piece is helping kids understand that unfairness hurts.
Boy, Donald, I could not agree more. Julie, I'm going to come back to you. I just want to say, I started my life in early childhood teaching very young children at Bing. It's where I met my parent venture partner, Bev Hartman. So Donald, you're speaking my language. And I want people to know who may not know, 4-year-olds are amongst some of the most caring and moral people in the world. So the idea that 4-year-olds may be too young to talk to kids is just not true. They have the level of understanding. They certainly know when you talk about something hurting or being hurtful or hurting their friends, they get that. They can get that. Julie, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, no worries. I was just going to add to that really important message. The second thing that I think is important to teach, which is that humans come in all kinds of different varieties, shapes, colors, sizes, etc. And so, yeah, we're really different from one another, and the differences are not bad. That's why saying, oh, I'm colorblind, I don't see race, that's not helpful right now. Those of us who are of color do not have the luxury of saying, oh, I'm colorblind. We are reminded of our color and its inferiority, wherever we go. We're trying to teach the next generation that, yeah, people are all different colors and different types of hair and noses and eyes and lips and height and weight, all of these things, different, very different, but nobody's better than anybody else. And nobody is worse than anybody else. That's key.
Great point. So, Eric, you have what I consider to be the coolest job title at Stanford, Chief Inclusion Officer, and you're at the Graduate School of Education. So you are teaching, or you're a part of an organization that teaches students. What is the primary thing that, in that role, that you're trying to get across to your college age and graduate students?
That's a great question, Charlene. Thank you for it. And I really, really appreciate everything all the panelists have said. I keep hearing the Sesame Street music in my head. Which one of these is not like the other? It's like all these brilliant people and this guy. What I'm really trying to impart to our students and to our faculty, honestly, is a spirit of grace. When it comes to these issues, when it comes to issues of racism, of prejudice, of homophobia, of sexism, of any ism, we all make mistakes. And sometimes it's not about not making mistakes. Sometimes it's about how do we respond to the mistake that we've made or that somebody else has made. One thing that I try to tell people all the time or try to teach is the skill of apologizing. When these things happen in the world, we see, and we've all seen this, right? These apologies. I'm sorry if anyone out there was offended. That was not my intent. Well, there's a big difference between intent and impact, I walk around when I talk a lot. If we were in a room, I'd be walking, and I ride a motorcycle. So I've got these big, giant motorcycle boots. And if I'm walking around, if I step on Julie's foot, I'm trying to be an entertaining speaker. But the impact of my action is she's still got a broken foot. I've got to deal with that broken foot, right? And that's my fault. And I need to apologize for that, even though that was not my intent. I also think it's important to follow up with apologies. It's not just the moment that you're sorry, but it's okay to email somebody or call somebody a week or two later and say, you know what? I just want you to know, Donald, I've been thinking about that thing that you said I offended you. I've been thinking about it, and it's still bugging me. I just want you to know. I think that's really important. One other thing I want to talk about, and it's a little bit of a shift. We've been talking about, microaggressions and macroaggressions and some negative things. How about a little micro-positivity? I'd like to encourage the parents out there, when you have opportunities, to say positive things about people of color that come up, and not just like, oh, isn't that Beyonce a wonderful dancer? But maybe, isn't Don Lemon really smart? Boy, I was really impressed by that thing Kamala Harris said on the news today. Did you guys see that? There are ways to do that in ways that aren't oppressive to you as a parent, right? You just bring it up from time to time. As a sports junkie, one thing that I did with my kids constantly when we were watching sports when they were little is we just pointed out whenever an announcer would say that a white athlete was like hardworking and really smart and a black athlete was a gifted, talented, physical specimen. As somebody who's a physical specimen and bad at sports, I wanted to point that out to my kids, right? And I think it's okay to say these things and just to incorporate it in your daily life all the time. Look for opportunities to be positive.
And that is just so great. Eric, I'm a sports fan too, and I know in my college dorm, first thing I did was put up all my baseball posters. Willie Mays, Willie McCovey, Bobby Bonds, and my roommate was white and from Hawaii, and she came in and saw the posters, but not me. And to this day, we still talk about, what that meant, that was her first impression of me. So again, well said. Before I give you sort of a final question, before we go into audience questions, I want to direct one thing to our developmental expert, Donald Grant, and that is, Donald, you know this. How can we guide our young children and adapt our conversations to be age appropriate? That is, how would you start a conversation about race with a very young child? I know we touched on this, but we have several of our attendees asking the question.
Yeah, just very briefly, and just to say, I was the dean of the School of Human Development for years and created curriculum and supported staff around this. And so we really took deep dives into this. I think one of the first things is to eliminate this construct of child fragility. We talk about a lot of isms, but we really underestimate the power and the resilience of children. And so we really believe that coming to them with these things is really going to debilitate them, when in reality, it's really going to strengthen them. So first, changing your mindset about it. Secondly, going into a space, understanding who your child is and what they need. And so when you look at developmental stages of trust versus mistrust, and you can get into all this Erickson and all this Vygotsky and really dig deep into that. But the fact of the matter is if you have a strong relationship with your child and you recognize where they are and what they need, you integrate these conversations through the vehicle of what you already know they need. Eric made a wonderful point earlier about his ability to give these micro positive messages about Black people to combat all the macro and micro negative messages that his children get. And so let's say your child loves dolls and you're 4 and she's 5 years old. I have a son, and I still went into the American Girl doll store because we were like, this is amazing. And we walked through, what if you go there and you take your 4-year-old and you're showing the diversity of those dolls, and you tell your child, can you imagine that, 15 years ago, mothers of Black children had to drive miles and miles and miles just to find a Black doll? Do you know what that means? There's so many examples. And I promise you, I believe that the conversation is really not about the developmental time in which we introduce it to children. I believe it's more about the developmental structure by which parents have done their work, that they're ready to deliver it. I think the biggest barriers are not about the kids. I really believe it's about the parents, whether you're Black, white, Latinx, Asian American. I just had a great conversation with a group of Asian Americans, and they had never talked about how white supremacy used them in an effort to really divide other Black and brown groups. And it was so enlightening to them and such an enriching conversation that they were then able to go home and talk to their Asian American children about how the model minority moniker is actually curated to create oppression for Black and brown people. And so being able to know your own stuff, it really becomes relatively easy to do it if you're dealing with your own stuff, to be honest with you.
Well said, Donald. Thank you. That's a really wonderful response. So in relation to that, I'm going to start again with some questions now from our audience who are asking wonderful, wonderful questions. I wish we had hours more. But anyway, let's try a few, okay? From Linda, systemic change should happen in K through 12th grade education. We keep talking about making changes, but nothing happens. What are some suggestions for talking about race in our schools? Anybody?
Well, I think that somebody made the point, I think it was Eric who said that some huge percentage of K-12 teachers are white. I think you said 75% or something like that, Eric. And because my theory of change is at the level of the individual, I think we've got to make a commitment to every single person who's a teacher in our public schools, which is a place we can regulate, must go through anti-racism workshops, training. They have to do the work on themselves if they're going to have any hope of being nurturing educators for Black and brown and Indigenous children.
So we know from the research that Black children learn better from Black teachers.
Remember, the research says all children do. North Carolina did a case study for a 3-year case study, and it demonstrated that all children who had a Black male teacher between 3rd and 5th grade all did better. The statistics for the Black children were much higher, definitely much higher, but it said that all children benefit from having at least one Black teacher in their elementary school life.
Thank you for that, Donald. I remember now reading that study too. That's really important. A conversation for another day would probably be, how do we get more minority teachers into the system? But here's someone who wrote, I hear we can't find minority educators. Really? What do you suggest? I mean, quickly, does anybody have an idea other than paying
Partnerships
teachers
with
what they're worth.
HBCUs, partnerships with HBCUs, partnerships with HBCUs and Black Greek organizations. There are thousands of places to go to get good Black people to teach.
Okay.
Well, I
Everybody
just,
get
just
that?
try harder. If you can't find them, then try harder. And I would also just recommend to parents, one thing that you can do at home is just, check your bookshelves, see if you have books about Black people just doing normal things. One of my favorite books that we used to read to my kids was a book called Lola at the Library. It's about a little girl, happens to be a girl with dark skin, and it talks about her day, like going to the library with her mother. At the end of the day, they have a little, coffee and ice cream together. And I think, it's really important that we start at an early age giving positive images of kids about Black and brown people doing normal things. I think, of course, we need to also talk about the ugly history of this country and overcoming oppression. But I think it's important that not all the stories that you have in your home about Black people be about overcoming, Jim Crow and slavery.
I couldn't agree with Kareem's point anymore. For me as a kid, that book was The Snowy Day by Ezra Jack Keats. And I'm sure that almost all of you can remember seeing like, wow, there's a book with a Black kid in the library. And being a Black kid, that was huge. But if we really want minority teachers, I think Donald's point about going to HBCUs is hugely important. Another one that I'd like to make is we've got to pay teachers a living wage, right? The teachers need to make a wage so that they can afford to live in the communities where they teach. If you're going to take a highly motivated, first generation or second generation person from a middle class or lower background and say, yeah, be a teacher in our district for $47,000 a year and have 3 roommates until you're 40, who's really going to sign up for that? If they've got other options and there's other things that they'd like to do. We've got to find a way to pay teachers a living wage for the communities that we live in. It's not enough to say, oh, you can live 45 minutes away.
Or 2 hours, as the case may be. Look at that. I've read that book. Oh, I've read those kids' books to my children at Bing and my own kids so many times.
My son is 10 years old. I still keep these on his bookshelf. They're way lower than any level he's reading right now. I just ran in there and grabbed them real quick because they're so important.
Nice.
Thank you, Donald. That makes us really happy. Okay, one more question about little kids, and then I'm going to ask you a final question to wrap up. This hour has gone so quickly. I wish we had you for more time, but boy, it's been wonderful today. All right, Julie asks, I have a 5-year-old and we've used recent current events to introduce talk about race and racism. Where do we go from here? Are there building blocks that I can follow to keep the conversation going? And as another person wrote, my son wants to help, but he says, what can I do? I'm just a kid. Anybody? Kareem, what do you think about that? How can kids help?
Yeah, I mean, I think kids have a lot of power and a lot of influence, and I think we have to build them up and give them the tools to be allies and upstanders. But I think it can just start. Of course, it has to be done in an age appropriate fashion. But for younger kids, just trying to broaden your circle and think about welcoming people into your circle who may look different from you, and trying to find common ground, commonality. I think that's an important place to start. I mean, what was the other part of the question?
Well, really just what now? She's been talking to her 5-year-old about current events, which I think is excellent. But what follows that? What can we do now?
Past events. They have to begin decolonizing history. Have a conversation about putting Christopher Columbus on trial for the atrocities of history and dismantling the historical privilege that makes white male privilege a thing, right? The reason why white privilege is a thing is because history has told them that they are privileged. And so dismantling that, I think, is another great step. Going through history and describing how white folk have reconstructed the stories of America, and helping white kids understand that. I think that's a great next step. And tangible things are participating in organizations that support Black and brown people. And it's not just Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter has been politicized. There's a difference between capital B, capital L, capital M, and the statement in a sentence that Black Lives Matter, and people aggregate them, and that's dangerous. But volunteering at the Ujima Center in Watts, I don't even know if there's really an Ujima Center in Watts, but it's a principle of Kwanzaa, so I'm confident it is. But doing things like that are valuable. Showing your kids that you're not going to join the board of the Boys and Girls Club, you're going to go to a really small organization where they don't have a top-notch lawyer on their board and support direct work. Those are things that you can model.
The thing that I'll add here is the question itself has the privilege of whiteness embedded in it. The person asking, and I don't mean to put this person on the spot, everybody does this. If you're white, you didn't mention your own race. You said, I have a 5-year-old. How do I keep the conversation about race going? Well, right? I can deduce from the way you framed your question that you're a white person genuinely asking this, but you didn't feel the need to say, I'm a white person, okay? If white parents can start infusing that reality and recognition into your own consciousness, into your language with your kids, that will help. And then I will add to the suggestions, look at the media you're consuming in your house. In addition to the books on your children's bookshelves, which should include the narratives of Black and brown children, not just white children, what television are you watching as a family? What movies are you seeing? Which podcasts are you listening to? If you want to make your world or your efforts in the world anti-racist, you have to be consuming the stories about other people. And you want to be modeling for your kids. This is the story we're going to watch today. And then you want to talk to them about it. What did you notice? One of the best things you can say to teenagers is, let's watch Black Panther. Let's watch Crazy Rich Asians if you're a white family, and then sit down with your kids and say, why do you suppose these movies have just had the huge impact they have had globally, but also in the Black and Asian communities? Because what you want to get to is, these are 2 examples of where, where Black people can go to the movie, Asian people can go to the movie and just see their own people thriving, not stereotypes, not beaten down, not being laughed at, just being amazing. And this is what we want our white kids to understand. You have the luxury of seeing yourself constantly reflected back at you doing amazing things. Let's get more of that happening for people of color.
So true, Julie. I shared a video about a little girl, about 3, Chinese, who was watching the film of Hamilton. And when Philippa Sue came on, the little girl kept pointing to the screen saying, that's me, mommy. It really does matter. So again, I know we're literally out of time, but one last final question for last words. Anybody, what gives you hope for the future?
Young people.
Young people.
The generation of folks who are like, 25, I'm using that number arbitrarily, and younger, are really making an incredible difference in the world. And when you look at how much of the current protests and the Black Lives Matter movement is being led by 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds from a variety of backgrounds, that gives me real hope and energy for the future.
Me too. As the parent of 2 of them, I couldn't agree more. Donald, what about you? What gives you hope?
Accountability. You got to pay attention to history. When we realized that right after Reconstruction, everything, we had Black politicians and all this Black wealth, then Jim Crow was waiting right around the corner. And so what wasn't there for me historically was accountability. And so this level of accountability that I'm seeing today, even though the murderers of Breonna Taylor have still not been arrested, this level of accountability that I'm seeing today is different than it was 50 years ago. And so that gives me hope. I was going to say youth, but Eric took that one. So I wanted to add something different. So I'll say accountability.
That's a great one. Kareem, how about you?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Eric and Donald said. Yeah, and I'm also very encouraged to see so many wonderful things happening in communities that aren't, classically thought of as being progressive or woke on social issues. I mean, you're seeing protests in, rural communities and, all around the country, and you see young children that are being actively involved in these protests and really standing up for what's right. So that gives me hope. And I think just taking a look at the New York Times bestseller list, which I peeked at this morning, you see the books that are at the top of the list. It's just a who's who of books on anti-racism. And so I think there's a lot a lot of reasons to be hopeful, but we have to keep pushing. I really hope that we can keep the momentum going, because I think a lot of us have been in this position before, where there's a wave of excitement and enthusiasm, and then momentum fades. And so I really want everyone to understand that this is not going to happen overnight, that we have to be diligent and persistent.
Thank you, Kareem. Really appreciate it. Julie, last word to you. What gives you hope?
I echo what my fellow panelists have said. I will add that what gives me hope is that most of us cannot stomach white supremacy and neo-Nazism and these other very violent, weaponized ideologies that have many of us in their crosshairs. This is a scary time. I know this isn't the highlight to end on, but like it or not, folks, this is the moment we are living through. It is our moment. Things are pretty darn scary. And if we're raising children, we have the opportunity to create a new population, a new society of humans who regard other humans as equal no matter what. It is our task as parents. And I think we're up to the task.
Well said, Julie. So again, I always close here. Typically, I'm standing in a school auditorium, but for those of you who are with us today listening, I want to say the goal of the Parent Education Series is to give you the tools and strategies and education you need to better talk to your kids. So your homework is to go home and talk to your children. Share with them something you heard today. Tell your kids' friends something that Kareem said, something that Eric said, something that Julie or Donald said. A lot of great advice. I'm going to watch this webinar myself 3 more times because you all gave such wonderful advice to all of our attendees. So I couldn't be more grateful to all of you. Thank you, thank you. And parents and attendees, good luck, take care, and stay well. We'll see you again soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure meeting all of you panelists. You guys are amazing.
Thank you all. Thank you. Really appreciate and respect tremendously the work that you do and who you are as people. So I just, gratitude to all of you, and wonderful to be on the panel with you today. And thank you, Charlene, for putting this all together.
Thank you, Kareem.
Somebody pointed out in the chat, if everybody, when they get the video, shares it with 5 more people, that is a way to kind of get this thing farther out into the world. So
that's a great idea.
Good advice, everybody.
Wonderful idea.
All right.
Great to meet you all.
Great to
Okay,
meet you all.
take care. See you
Looking
soon.
forward
Take
to
care. Be well.
everybody's
Be well.
work.
Bye,
Okay,
everybody.
bye-bye.
Take care.